November 1883, 14 miles south of Helena, Montana Territory. 28-year-old Sarah Lindholm pressed a shovel into frozen ground while four neighboring homesteaders watched from their horses, shaking their heads. She wasn't building up, she was building down. And in a land where winter could kill you 6 different ways, that seemed like madness with a death wish attached. The men had ridden over that morning expecting to find a widow raising timber for a proper cabin. Instead, they found her excavating a hole in the side of a south-facing slope, pile of dirt growing beside her like a grave she was digging for herself. Thomas Brennan, who'd survived 3 Montana winters and lost 2 toes to prove it, was the first to speak. "Mrs. Lindholm, I've seen plenty of foolishness in these territories, but this takes the prize. You're building yourself a tomb, not a home." Sarah didn't stop digging. Her late husband Eric had been dead 4 months, kicked by a horse in July. The land claim was hers now, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. But the claim meant nothing if she couldn't survive until spring. She had 7 months of supplies, 12 cords of wood she'd cut herself, and a design in her head that nobody else seemed to understand. "It's called an earth-bermed dugout, Mr. Brennan. My grandfather built one in Norway. Kept his family alive through winters that make Montana look tame." "Norway," muttered James Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who'd been in the territory since '79. He'd built his own cabin the traditional way, logs chinked with mud, roof of split shingles. Cost him 6 weeks of hard labor and most of his timber. "We're not in Norway, ma'am. We're in Montana, and Montana plays by different rules." The third man, Robert Chen, had come from California by way of the railroad camps. He'd learned American building the hard way, watching crews throw up structures that the wind knocked down. He studied Sarah's excavation with narrowed eyes, calculating something the others missed. "How deep are you planning to go?" 8 feet into the slope," Sarah said, finally pausing to wipe her brow. It was 34 degrees, cold enough that her breath fogged, warm enough that digging raised a sweat. "Stone foundation, sod walls on the exposed sides, heavy timber roof covered with 3 feet of earth. The hillside does half the work." The fourth skeptic was Martha Brennan, Thomas's wife, who'd ridden over with the men because she didn't trust Sarah not to collapse the hillside on herself. Martha had survived a winter in a tent back in '81, lost her first baby to pneumonia, and she didn't have patience for experiments. 3 feet of earth will cave in your roof, Sarah. You'll be crushed in your sleep. The beams are cottonwood, 14 inches thick. The ceiling joists are 6-inch lodge pole pine, spaced 8 inches apart. Sarah's voice stayed level, factual. She'd done the mathematics twice, checked them against Eric's old engineering notes. He'd worked railroad bridges before they came west. The load capacity is 847 pounds per square foot. 3 feet of earth is roughly 250 pounds per square foot. Even with snow accumulation, I've got a safety margin of 3 to 1. Thomas Brennan squinted at her like she'd started speaking Norwegian. "You lost me at capacity, ma'am. All I know is that dirt is heavy and winter is coming, and you're talking yourself into a situation where spring will find you frozen in a collapsed hole." But Sarah had already turned back to her digging. She had 6 weeks before the first serious snow, maybe 8 if luck held. The skeptics could watch her ride away, made no difference to her. The design was sound. Her grandfather had survived the winter of 1847 in northern Norway, when temperatures hit -43 and stayed there for 16 days. His earth-bermed dugout, set into a hillside just like this one, had kept his family alive while their neighbors in traditional wooden cottages burned through firewood they didn't have. The principle was simple. Earth doesn't freeze more than a few feet down. Build into it, and you're building into a temperature that stays constant, somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees year-round. Heat that space even a little, and you're comfortable. Fight against it with a wooden box sitting on top of frozen ground, and you're burning cord after cord just to stay alive. The concept wasn't purely Norwegian either. The Pawnee had built earth lodges for generations, using the same principle. So had the Mandans up north, creating structures that stayed warm in -30 weather with minimal fire. Sarah had read about them in a book Eric brought back from Helena, accounts from traders who'd visited the upper Missouri in the 1830s. Different cultures, same solution. Work with the earth, not against it. Over the next 4 weeks, Sarah worked 12-hour days. She excavated the hillside first, creating a space 17 feet wide, 24 feet deep, with an 8-foot ceiling at the front sloping to 6 feet at the back where it met solid hillside. She hit rock 4 feet in, which was perfect, natural drainage, and a solid foundation. She laid flat stones for the floor, fitting them tight, filling gaps with clay and sand. The front wall she built from sod blocks, cut from her own land, each block 12 inches thick and stacked with the grass side in, roots creating a natural binding that would strengthen as it settled. James Kowalski rode by in the third week, watching her hoist a cottonwood beam into place with a lever and fulcrum system. "You're going to kill yourself, Mrs. Lindholm. Let me get my sons. We'll help you raise those timbers properly." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Kowalski, but I've got it figured." Sarah had learned the principle from Eric, who'd moved bridge timbers using nothing but leverage and patience. The beam weighed roughly 380 pounds, far too heavy to lift, easy to maneuver if you understood angles and pivot points. She had the beam positioned by afternoon, first of 6 that would span the width of the dugout. By mid-October, the structure was enclosed. 6 cottonwood beams ran across the space, supporting dozens of lodge pole joists, which in turn supported a lattice of willow branches she'd woven tight. Over that went canvas, then a layer of dry grass, then the earth itself, 3 feet of it, tamped down and graded so rain would run off. The front wall had a door made from split pine, fitted tight, with a small window beside it, real glass that cost her $12 in Helena. The window faced south, catching what sun the winter offered, and she'd built a wooden shutter for it, closed at night, open during the day. The interior was simple but calculated. A stone fireplace at the back built into the hillside itself, chimney running up through the earth and emerging 12 feet from the dugout's front, sleeping platform on the east side, raised 18 inches off the floor, storage shelves dug into the walls themselves, lined with planks. A work table, 2 chairs, a water barrel. She'd plastered the interior walls with clay mixed with grass, creating a smooth surface that wouldn't shed dirt. The ceiling she left exposed, the wooden lattice visible, but she'd sealed it well enough that earth didn't filter through. Thomas Brennan came by the day she finished, studied the structure from outside, walked around it twice, finally shook his head. "I'll grant you this, Mrs. Lindholm. It's the strangest thing I've seen in Montana, and I once saw a man try to farm wheat at 7,000 feet. But strange doesn't mean it'll work. That first real cold snap, you'll find out what you've built yourself into. I guess we'll see, Mr. Brennan." Sarah was tired, bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from 6 weeks of 14-hour days. But she was done. The structure was solid. She moved her supplies in over the next week, 1,200 pounds of flour, salt pork, beans, dried apples, coffee, sugar, lard. She had seed for spring, tools, ammunition for Eric's rifle, candles, kerosene for the lamp. She was as ready as preparation could make her. Now, I want to take a moment here, because if you're watching this, you're probably someone who understands that old knowledge isn't outdated knowledge. The techniques that kept people alive in the 1880s, they're not museum pieces. They're proven solutions that worked when failure meant death. If you value that kind of wisdom, if you want to see more stories about the ingenuity that built this country, then join the community we're building here. Subscribe to help preserve these accounts before they're lost to time. We're documenting forgotten techniques, real frontier knowledge, and we need people who understand why that matters. The first snow came on November 3rd, 6 inches overnight, nothing serious. Sarah woke in her earth-bermed dugout to silence. Outside, wind was blowing. She could hear it, but inside the temperature held steady at 52 degrees, and she hadn't lit the morning fire yet. The thermal mass was working exactly as predicted. The earth surrounding her space, millions of pounds of it, was holding temperature like a battery holds charge. She lit a small fire, just enough to boil coffee and fry salt pork, and within 20 minutes the interior was at 64 degrees. Comfortable. Not burning through wood, just sipping it. She walked over to the Kowalski place 3 days later, found James and his 2 sons splitting wood in their yard. The wind was blowing steady at 15 miles per hour, temperature at 28 degrees, and they were working in heavy coats. Their cabin, a solid log structure with a good roof, was visible behind them, smoke pouring from the chimney. "How much wood are you burning, Mr. Kowalski?" Sarah asked. James paused, wiping his forehead despite the cold. "Half a quart a week, maybe a bit more when it gets serious. Why do you ask?" "I'm burning about 18 pounds a day. Call it 1/10 of a cord per week. She let that sit for a moment. I'm running 5 times more efficient than you are, and my place is warmer. James's elder son, Martin, spoke up. He was 19, had opinions about most things. No offense, Mrs. Lindholm, but I'd rather live in a real house and burn more wood than live in a hole like a prairie dog. Fair enough, Sarah said. But when you're splitting wood in a blizzard because you ran through your supply in February, remember that prairie dogs don't freeze to death. The serious cold hit in late November. Temperature dropped to -12 on the 24th, stayed below zero for 6 straight days. Sarah's dugout interior never fell below 48 degrees, even when she let the fire go out overnight. She'd wake in the morning, breath not quite fogging, light a small fire, and be comfortable within half an hour. The earth around her was a massive insulator, resisting the temperature change outside. Cold penetrated maybe 2 feet into the ground, nowhere near the 8 feet where her living space sat. Martha Brennan came by in early December, ostensibly to borrow some thread, really to see if Sarah had frozen to death yet. She stepped into the dugout and stopped, blinking in surprise. It's warmer in here than in our cabin, and you don't even have a fire going. Earth holds heat, Sarah explained, and it holds it evenly. No drafts, no cold spots, no wind finding its way through chinking. You build with wood, you're constantly fighting against air movement. I've got 8 feet of hillside and 3 feet of earth roof. Air isn't going anywhere. Martha touched the interior wall, felt the dry clay surface. It doesn't feel like a hole. It feels like, I don't know, a real home, just quieter. Quieter is right. Sound doesn't carry through 8 feet of earth. I can't hear the wind unless I open the door. Sarah poured coffee, strong and hot, and the 2 women sat at the small table. How's your wood supply holding? Martha's face tightened. Thomas says we'll make it, but we're burning more than he planned. He's talking about tearing down the old chicken coop for fuel if we run short. That was the reality of wooden structures in Montana winter. They required constant feeding, constant maintenance, constant attention. You had to seal every gap, fight every draft, burn cord after cord just to maintain livable temperature. Sarah's design traded labor up front for efficiency downstream. She'd worked herself half to death in October, but now, in December, she was spending maybe an hour a day on fire management. The rest of her time went to other things: mending clothes, reading Eric's books, planning her spring planting. The big storm hit on January 17, 1884. Sarah woke to silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. She opened her door and couldn't see 10 feet, snow falling so thick it was like looking into a white wall. The wind was blowing 40 miles per hour out of the northwest, temperature at -22, and the combination meant effective temperature somewhere around -65. That was the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes, that froze lungs if you breathed too deep, that turned a quarter-mile walk into a death sentence. Sarah closed the door, latched it, checked her supplies. She had wood for 3 weeks at normal consumption, food for 6 months, water in the barrel. She lit a small fire, just enough to take the edge off the interior chill, and settled in to wait. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, she could barely hear it. The earth around her absorbed the sound the same way it absorbed the cold, layer after layer of insulation that made the storm seem distant, almost theoretical. The blizzard lasted 4 days. Snow accumulated at roughly 2 inches per hour, building up on every surface. Sarah's earth-bermed roof handled it without complaint. The 3 feet of earth she'd placed there was already heavy, already calculated into the load capacity. Another 3 feet of snow added maybe 75 pounds per square foot, well within the safety margin. The pitch she'd built into the roof, slight but deliberate, meant snow actually added insulation rather than just weight. More mass above meant more thermal buffer below. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind stopped. Sarah opened her door to a world transformed. Snow had drifted to the height of a man in some places, completely burying fence lines and outbuildings. The sky was crystalline blue, temperature at -31, and nothing was moving. No smoke from chimneys, no animals, no sound except the creak of her boots on snow. She grabbed Eric's rifle and started walking toward the Brennan place half a mile east. She found Thomas Brennan 40 feet from his cabin, face down in a drift. He wasn't dead, not quite, but he was close. His lips were blue, his hands weren't responding, and he couldn't talk coherently. Sarah got him upright, got his arm over her shoulder, and started dragging him back toward his cabin. Martha met them at the door, face white with panic. He went to get wood from the shed. He's been gone 2 hours. The interior of the Brennan cabin told the story. The fire was down to coals, the temperature maybe 35 degrees, and Martha had been trying to keep their 6-year-old daughter warm under every blanket they owned. They'd run through their wood supply faster than planned, and the shed was 60 feet away, a distance that would have been nothing in normal weather, but was potentially lethal in -31 temperatures with 40-foot snowdrifts. Sarah made a decision. Pack what you need. You're coming to my place. Martha stared at her. Your dugout? All of us? It's warm, it's safe, and I've got wood. Move. They made the trip in 20-minute stages, Sarah breaking trail, Martha carrying their daughter, Thomas struggling along behind, still half frozen. When they finally stumbled into Sarah's dugout, the contrast was shocking. The interior temperature was 54 degrees, comfortable enough that Martha immediately started crying with relief. Sarah built up the fire, got Thomas positioned close to it, wrapped the little girl in wool blankets. You'll stay here until the weather breaks. I've got supplies for 1, but we can stretch them for 4. Thomas Brennan, his speech finally returning as his body warmed, looked around the interior with new eyes. I called this a tomb. I was wrong. You were working with the information you had, Sarah said. Traditional cabins work fine in moderate cold. This isn't moderate cold. Over the next 2 days, the temperature stayed lethal. -28 the first day, -33 the second. Sarah's dugout held steady at 56 degrees with a modest fire going, burning maybe 25 pounds of wood per day, even with 4 people. The thermal mass didn't care how many people were inside. It just kept buffering the temperature, resisting the extremes, maintaining equilibrium. The Brennans slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets, warmer than they'd been in their own cabin. Robert Chen came by on the 3rd day, having snowshoed over from his claim 2 miles south. He'd weathered the storm in his own cabin, burning furniture by the end to keep from freezing. I heard the Brennans were here. Came to check if anyone needed help. He stepped inside, stopped, ran his hand along the clay-plastered wall. This is remarkable, Mrs. Lindholm. What's the interior temperature? 56 degrees with a small fire. Was 52 before I built it up this morning. Sarah poured him coffee, the pot staying warm on the edge of the fireplace. How cold did your place get? Hit 38 during the worst of it. I was burning everything that wasn't structural. Robert was a practical man, not given to exaggeration. He'd learned construction in the California gold camps, built structures in the Sierra Nevada, thought he understood cold weather building. I was wrong about your design. I thought you were building a novelty. You were building a solution. The storm broke on the 4th day. Temperature climbed to -18, which felt almost balmy after the previous extremes. Sarah walked over to the Kowalski place and found a tragedy. James had tried to reach his woodshed during the worst of the storm, made it maybe 30 feet before the cold took him down. His sons found him 6 hours later, frozen solid. The family was preparing to leave Montana as soon as spring allowed, heading back to family in Wisconsin. Martin Kowalski, who'd mocked Sarah's prairie dog hole, couldn't meet her eyes when she came to pay respects. Word of Sarah's design spread fast in a territory where news traveled slow. By February, she'd had 11 different homesteaders come by to look at the structure, take measurements, ask questions. Some of them were skeptical even after seeing it, conditioned by tradition to believe that real homes were built above ground, from wood in the conventional way. But others were calculating, running the mathematics in their heads, comparing their wood consumption to hers. Henrik Johansson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd settled 15 miles north, stood in Sarah's dugout for 10 minutes without speaking, just looking, processing. Finally, he turned to her. My family built like this in Trondheim. I thought it wouldn't work here. Thought Montana was too cold. I was wrong. It works anywhere the ground doesn't freeze deep, Sarah explained. The principle is universal. Earth is thermal mass. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature. My grandfather's dugout in Norway held at 47 degrees all winter. Mine holds at 52. The difference is latitude, sun angle, exact depth. But the physics don't change. Henrik started building his own earth-bermed dugout in March, as soon as the ground thawed enough to excavate. He added his own innovations, things he remembered from Norway, a double-door entry to create an airlock, reducing heat loss, a ventilation system using natural convection, pulling fresh air in low, exhausting stale air high, a sleeping loft, taking advantage of heat rising, creating a space that stayed comfortable even when the main floor cooled. He built it for his wife, his 3 children, and his elderly mother, who'd been suffering in their drafty wooden cabin. Thomas Brennan didn't build a dugout. He was too invested in his cabin, too many hours of labor to abandon it. But he did modify his approach. He bermed earth against the north wall 3 feet deep, creating a thermal buffer against the prevailing winter winds. He insulated his attic with a foot of grass, reducing heat loss through the roof. He built a smaller room within his cabin, a winter room, easier to heat and maintain, where the family could consolidate during the worst cold. His wood consumption dropped by 40% the following winter. Robert Chen took the concept in a different direction. He built a combination structure, traditional log cabin for the above-ground living space, earth-bermed storage cellar below, accessed by interior stairs. The cellar stayed at 48 degrees year-round, perfect for food storage, and the mass of earth beneath the cabin floor helped stabilize the temperature above. He called it a hybrid design, best of both approaches, and he was probably right. Martha Brennan became one of Sarah's strongest advocates. She talked to other women in the territory, explaining what she'd experienced during the January storm, how Sarah's design had saved her family. Women listened to Martha in ways they didn't always listen to men, because Martha had been there, had felt the difference, had watched her daughter stay warm in temperatures that would have killed her in their own cabin. By 1885, 7 families within 20 miles of Helena had built some variation of earth-bermed structures, each one adapted to their specific site, needs, and resources. The technical arguments against earth-bermed construction were legitimate, which was why Sarah never dismissed them. Yes, excavation was labor-intensive, requiring weeks of hard work before you had shelter. Yes, moisture management was critical, requiring proper drainage and ventilation to prevent mold and damp. Yes, structural integrity depended on proper beam sizing and load calculations, things most homesteaders didn't understand. A poorly built dugout could collapse, could flood, could become a miserable hole that justified every skeptic's concerns. The difference between success and failure was knowledge, precision, and understanding of principles. Sarah spent the winter of 1884-85 documenting her design, creating drawings and notes that other builders could follow. She measured everything: beam dimensions, spacing intervals, earth depth, ceiling pitch, wall thickness. She recorded interior temperatures at different times of day, in different weather conditions, with different fire intensities. She calculated her wood consumption month by month, compared it to conventional cabins, proved the efficiency mathematically. The data was overwhelming. Her dugout used 1/5 the wood of a comparable cabin, maintained more stable temperature, required less maintenance, and cost roughly 60% as much to build if you valued labor at zero. The economic argument mattered in a territory where cash was scarce and labor was abundant. A homesteader had time but no money. Building a conventional cabin required purchased nails, milled lumber, glass windows, a stove. Building an earth-bermed dugout required a shovel, an axe, and knowledge. The roof beams Sarah used were raw cottonwood, cut from her own land, not milled. The sod blocks cost nothing but labor. The stone foundation was collected from a creek bed. Her total cash outlay was maybe $40, mostly for the window and door hardware. A conventional cabin would have cost 3 times that minimum. Now, if you're still watching this, you understand something important. This isn't just a story about one woman in Montana. It's about questioning assumptions, testing received wisdom against reality, being willing to learn from cultures and traditions that took different paths. The frontier rewarded that kind of thinking. It punished people who assumed their way was the only way. If you value that perspective, if you want to support content that challenges conventional thinking with historical evidence, then hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show these stories to more people who need to see them. Simple click, meaningful impact. Spring came late in 1885. Snow lingered until mid-April, then melted in a rush that turned every creek into a torrent. Sarah planted her first crop in early May: wheat, potatoes, turnips, beans. The land was good, rich soil deposited by ancient floods, and everything grew with vigor. She had help that first season. Neighbors who'd seen what she'd survived, who'd learned from her design. Robert Chen helped her plow the fields, his horses stronger than her single draft animal. Martha Brennan helped with planting, sharing seeds, exchanging knowledge about which varieties worked best in Montana's short growing season. By autumn, Sarah had harvested 8 bushels of wheat, 240 pounds of potatoes, enough turnips and beans to fill her storage cellar. She'd proven she could survive, could make the land productive, could meet the requirements of the Homestead Act. The claim was secure. But more than that, she'd proven that innovation wasn't recklessness, that unconventional didn't mean unworkable, that wisdom could come from multiple sources if you were willing to listen. James Kowalski's death haunted the community through that year and beyond. He'd been a good man, experienced, strong, not foolish or reckless. He'd simply been caught by conditions that exceeded his preparation. The question that nobody wanted to ask but everyone thought about was whether he'd still be alive if he'd built different shelter. There was no way to know for certain, but the evidence suggested that earth-bermed construction might have made the difference. The Brennans had survived the same storm in Sarah's dugout, comfortable and safe. The Kowalskis in their conventional cabin had lost their husband and father. That weight shaped the community's thinking. By 1887, roughly 30% of new homestead construction in the Helena region incorporated earth-berming principles in some form. Not everyone went as far as Sarah, building fully underground. But more people were banking earth against north walls, insulating with sod, using thermal mass to buffer temperature swings. The traditional all-wood cabin remained common, but it was no longer the only option, no longer the unquestioned default. Sarah lived in her earth-bermed dugout for 11 years, until 1894, when she married a widower named Carl Schmidt and moved to his established ranch 20 miles east. She left the dugout to a young couple just starting out, Swedish immigrants who didn't have the resources for conventional construction. They lived in it for another 15 years, raised 3 children there, eventually built a larger home nearby but kept the dugout as storage and storm shelter. The structure lasted until 1923, when new owners of the land filled it in, not understanding what it represented, seeing only an obsolete hole in the ground. But the principle didn't die. Earth-bermed construction continued in Montana and across the northern plains, particularly among immigrants from northern Europe who remembered similar designs from home. The techniques evolved, incorporating new materials and methods, but the core insight remained. Work with the earth, not against it. Use mass to stabilize temperature. Minimize surface area exposed to extreme weather. Let the ground itself do half the work of shelter. Modern studies of 19th century frontier architecture have validated what Sarah understood through observation and mathematics. Earth-bermed structures, when properly built, demonstrate heating efficiency 300 to 500% better than comparable wood frame buildings. They maintain interior temperatures within a 15-degree range regardless of exterior extremes. They require minimal maintenance once constructed. They prove that sometimes the best solution isn't the most obvious one, isn't the traditional one, isn't the one everyone else is using. The skeptics in Sarah's story weren't villains. They were experienced people working from legitimate knowledge, making reasonable predictions based on what they'd seen work and fail. Thomas Brennan had survived 3 Montana winters in a conventional cabin. His skepticism made sense. Robert Chen had built structures across the Sierra Nevada. His doubts were grounded in real experience. Even Martha Brennan, who became an advocate, started from a place of concern rooted in past trauma. None of them were wrong to question. They were wrong to assume questioning meant the answer had to be no. Sarah's quiet persistence, her willingness to demonstrate rather than argue, her openness to sharing knowledge once she'd proven it worked, that's what changed minds. She didn't mock the skeptics or dismiss their concerns. She acknowledged the legitimate risks, showed how she'd address them, let the results speak for themselves. When the January storm hit, she didn't say, "I told you so." She opened her door and said, "You're welcome to stay." That generosity, that focus on survival over vindication, that's what built trust and community. The frontier attracted people who were willing to try new approaches, who had to be willing because the old approaches didn't always work in new environments. But it also punished people who tried things recklessly, without thought, without understanding principles. The balance between innovation and caution, between learning from tradition and questioning it, That balance defined who survived and who didn't. Sarah understood both sides. She innovated based on proven principles, tested through generations in similar climates. She didn't invent earth-burning. She adapted it, applied it, demonstrated it. There's a tendency to romanticize frontier life, to imagine it as simpler or more authentic than modern existence. That's nonsense. It was brutal, unforgiving, isolating, and dangerous. People died from things we consider trivial now. Infected cuts, contaminated water, storms they couldn't predict. But within that brutality, there was also clarity. Solutions either worked or they didn't. Knowledge either kept you alive or it got you killed. There was no room for ideology divorced from results, no space for theories that didn't survive contact with reality. Sarah's earth-burned dugout worked. It kept her alive through winters that killed others. It used a fraction of the resources that conventional approaches demanded. It proved itself through the only test that mattered: survival. The fact that it looked strange, that it violated conventional wisdom, that it made people uncomfortable, none of that mattered against the mathematical reality of 5 times better thermal efficiency and the practical reality of warmth in -30 weather. You can still find remnants of earth-burned structures across Montana if you know where to look and what you're looking for. Most have collapsed, filled in, been deliberately demolished. A few remain, preserved by accident or intention, small museums of practical wisdom. They don't look like much from outside, these humps of earth and faded timbers. But if you understand what they represented, what they proved, what they cost in labor, and what they saved in lives, they're monuments to human ingenuity as surely as any cathedral or castle. The lesson isn't build earth-burned dugouts. The lesson is broader, more fundamental. When everyone tells you something won't work, it's worth asking whether they've actually tested it or whether they're just repeating what they've heard. When tradition and innovation conflict, the answer isn't automatically with tradition, isn't automatically with innovation. The answer is with results, with evidence, with honest measurement against clear standards. Sarah didn't argue theory with her skeptics. She built her dugout, measured her wood consumption, survived the winter, and let the numbers speak for themselves. In a territory where the margin between survival and death was measured in degrees of temperature and cords of wood, that kind of clear-eyed pragmatism wasn't optional. It was mandatory. You could be proud, you could be traditional, you could be certain you were right. But if your approach burned wood you didn't have and left your family shivering in temperatures that could kill them, then your approach was wrong. Sarah's approach was strange, unconventional, unsettling to people who equated proper shelter with above-ground wooden structures. But it worked. And on the frontier, working was the only credential that ultimately mattered. The story of Sarah Lindholm and her earth-burned dugout isn't unique. Similar stories played out across the frontier, in different forms, with different innovations, among different communities. What makes it worth remembering is what it demonstrates: that knowledge crosses cultures, that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, that being willing to question assumptions can literally save lives. The Norwegian grandfather who'd survived the winter of 1847, the Pawnee earth lodges that had sheltered families for generations, the mathematical principles of thermal mass and insulation that work the same whether you're in Norway or Montana or anywhere else, all of it came together in one widow's decision to build down instead of up. And when the blizzard hit, when the temperature dropped to levels that killed a strong man 40 feet from his own cabin, when the wind screamed and the snow piled 6 feet deep, Sarah's strange hole in the ground did exactly what she'd designed it to do. It stayed warm. It stayed safe. It kept people alive. That's not a story about being lucky or being stubborn. It's a story about understanding principles, applying them correctly, and having the courage to trust the mathematics even when everyone around you says you're wrong. If you've made it this far, you're part of a community that values this kind of knowledge. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're proven solutions to real problems, techniques that worked when failure meant death, wisdom that deserves preservation before it's lost completely. Subscribe to this channel. Help us document these stories, share them, keep them alive. The frontier tested ideas in the harshest possible laboratory, and the solutions that survived those tests are worth our attention, our respect, and our memory. Sarah Lindholm died in 1919, at age 64, surrounded by children and grandchildren. She never wrote a book, never sought recognition, never claimed to be anything more than a widow who'd needed shelter and built what made sense to her. But her influence rippled outward, through communities, through generations, through people who saw what she'd done and understood that knowledge isn't limited by borders or tradition. It's limited only by our willingness to learn, to test, to measure results against clear standards and accept what the evidence tells us. That's a lesson worth carrying forward. Not just about building techniques or thermal dynamics, but about how we approach problems, how we evaluate solutions, how we balance tradition against innovation. The frontier is gone, that physical space where you could claim land and test yourself against nature's extremes. But the principles that kept people alive there, they're not gone. They're still true, still applicable, still waiting for anyone who's willing to look past assumptions and ask whether there might be a better way. Sarah's earth-berm dugout stood for 40 years. The knowledge it represented has lasted far longer. And as long as we're willing to learn from it, to understand what made it work, to apply those principles in our own challenges, that knowledge will continue to prove its worth. Because in the end, what kept Sarah alive wasn't stubbornness or luck, it was understanding. And understanding, once gained, doesn't die unless we let it.